Good afternoon. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove, and it's time to look at Jeremiah chapter 2, which will be our 259th step in our walking tour through the Bible. Now, it's a longish chapter, but certain things jump out at you. First of all, God starts off by saying, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and shout this in Jerusalem's ears." None of this sort of speak gently to Jerusalem, which we got, if you remember, in the book of the Consolation of Israel in the second or third Isaiah. None of this, let's woo Jerusalem, let's be gentle with Jerusalem. No, this is holler down their ear holes, because sure as eggs is eggs, they are not listening, they can't listen, they are deaf, or in fact, they're closing their ears to the word of God. So they won't listen to God, but you must be completely and utterly determined that your message gets through. Shout it into their ears. Never give up. And indeed, this goes back to what was said in chapter 1. It says, chapter 1, verse 17, have no fear of them, and in their presence I will make you fearless. So don't be frightened of them, don't be put off. You really are going to have to insist on this because they're deaf as posts. Well, that sounds a bit like us, doesn't it? Our contemporary situation. Nobody's listening, but somehow or another we've got to be insistent and keep up the message, not give up. Now, the people have turned aside from God. Well, that's pretty standard for the prophets. But here it's, yet my people have exchanged their glory, that is God, for the useless one, meaning the idol, the non-God. Now, one of the things that Jeremiah believes, and he's right about this, is that God is God, and the other gods are not gods at all. They're illusions, they're idols, they are objects, but they are absolutely not God. In other words, it's a waste of time worshipping them. They are non-existent beings. Later on, much later on, there comes an interpretation often given by Christians that the pagan gods are in fact devils, masquerading as gods. But Jeremiah seems to think they're just illusory. Now, in this passage, one of the things that comes to mind as you read it is that famous saying, which goes like this: when people stop believing in God, they don't just believe in nothing, they believe in anything at all. This phrase is actually usually attributed to G.K. Chesterton, but there's no evidence he ever said it. But it is a truism. Once people abandon the God who is their glory, then they will go chasing after alien gods. They seem to lie down on every high hill and under every green tree, and you have sprawled and played the whore. That's verse 20. In other words, you've gone after every single cult available. You forgot the worship of the true God, and you've replaced him with a whole load of futile cults, futile religious practices, and so on. Now, why have they done this? Well, have they lost their ability to think? I think that's part of it. Or maybe what the loss of the ability to think and to be rational is the symptom of their apostasy. Having abandoned right belief, right practice, true belief in the one true God, then their mental faculties have effectively collapsed. And here it says, verse 20, it is long ago now since you broke your yoke, burst your bonds, and said, I will not serve. This is how God, through Jeremiah, characterizes unbelief or the rejection of God. You have said, I will not serve. Non serviam in Latin, which is usually the phrase we attribute to Satan himself. Why did Satan rebel against God? Because he could not bear to be in a subservient position. Subservient, you see. I will not serve. No, I cannot be number two. Better, as Milton tells us, Satan says, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, even though hell It's, of course, the most awful place on earth. Well, it's not on earth, actually. It's the most awful place. And if you remember Marlowe in Dr. Faustus, the devil says to Dr. Faustus, "Oh, Faustus, please stop going on about these things. Do you think that I, who looked upon the face of God," I can't remember how the rest of the quote goes, but he says, "Hell is, this is hell, nor am I out of it," he says, when Faustus asks where hell is. Hell is the knowledge that you once had God and now you've lost him forever. But the person who rebels against God prefers to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Non serviam, I will not serve. It's now long since you broke your yoke and burst your bonds. Now, what yoke was this? What bonds were these? Now, the yoke, if you remember, is the sort of thing you have around your neck, which is, of course, what draft animals wear. And, of course, you know, if you're a slave and you're under the yoke, it means you're wearing a slave's collar and you are sometimes dragging things and so on, being used like a beast of burden. Horrible existence. And, of course, if you're a slave, quite frequently you're in chains, you're tied up. Well, hang on. Who has put us under the yoke and who has put us in chains? What is this bondage? What is this yoke? Well, Jesus replies, maybe he's thinking of this passage, "My yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And of course, the bondage of God is not bondage at all, it's liberation. God has given us his law, but his law is not bondage. In fact, the more we keep the law of God, the more we will be free. Jesus makes it clear that faith is that which sets us free rather than binds us or enslaves us. The famous phrase of Jesus about the truth shall set you free. Now, the trouble with these people who've said, "Non serviam, I will not serve," is they've got the wrong impression of God. A bit like Adam and Eve back in the day, they see God as a tyrant, the one who forbids. You must not touch that tree in the middle of the garden. Therefore, God is a tyrant. But in fact, God has said you must not touch that tree in the middle of the garden for a very good reason. In fact, when God set limits for us to observe, he sets limits for us to observe for our good and out of love. There are limits to every type of human action. Eat, but don't eat too much. Drink, but don't drink too much. Sleep, but don't sleep too much. Everything is limited because if we go too far, we destroy any true happiness or possibility of happiness that we might have. Instead of being well-fed, well, well-fed, watered people, we will end up being gluttons, and we'll also, sorry about that, we'll end up being gluttons, we'll end up being the most unfortunate of human beings indeed. Anyway, there's always a limit. Love, but don't love too much. Here are one who loved not wisely, but too well, as if you remember Othello says about himself. We can take everything too far. We've got to accept limits. And accepting limits to ourselves, limits that are placed there by nature and by God, we're not being slaves. We're finding freedom. And that's rather important. Now, anyway, and so he goes on and on and on. And finally, he says, "How well you have set your course in pursuit of love." That's verse 13. And that being very sarcastic. In other words, in fact, he actually describes Israel as like a donkey on heat in the desert, desperately looking for another donkey. How well you've set your course in pursuit of love. And so you have schooled your ways to wicked deeds. The pursuit of love is a good thing, but you've got to have the right object, and you've got to be rational in your pursuit of love, and you mustn't let your pursuit be headlong, something that drives you over the edge into madness. How frivolously you undertake to change course, he says in verse 36. Anyway, it's a good passage, this, so do please read it. It's really a rather useful passage as well. Now, God is calling us to renounce our pride. You know, when somebody's right and you know they're right, and you say, yeah, I know he's right, or you say to yourself, I know they're right, but I'm never going to admit it. That's pride. God is right. To follow God is to follow the right path and the path to happiness. So let's not deny ourselves happiness by wallowing in our pride. Let us rather follow the Lord. All the very best. Sorry about that telephone call coming in. I hope it didn't disturb you too much. Have fun with chapter 2 of Jeremiah. Bye.